Hello, my name is Ryan Patterson. I work at the Accessibility Institute at Carleton University. I'm not on the screen. My voice is playing over a title slide that reads, Bridging the Gaps, Community Engaged Research at the Accessibility Institute at Carleton University. Dr. Boris Vukovic, Tara Connolly, Kathy Malcolm Edwards, Dr. Brady Laska, Dr. Ryan Patterson. Several curved red streaks flow like waves along the bottom of a white background. The Carleton University crest, a red maple leaf above two white waves, appears at the bottom right. All of our slides today will be slight variations of this visual, and I will recite all text that appears on screen. Carleton and the Accessibility Institute are located on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. We also recognize the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation as the traditional custodians of the land where this conference is taking place. The Institute is a hub for accessibility, focusing on research and development, training and consulting, advocacy, and community engagement. We lead the implementation of Carleton's Coordinated Accessibility Strategy and serve as the national office of the Canadian Accessibility Network, CAN, a partnership of 108 organizations and over 200 individuals. We are always looking for new ways to identify gaps and remove barriers, a passion we know we share with all of you participating in this conference. Today, I'm going to introduce you to 4 members of our team to talk about 4 different ways that we are addressing accessibility gaps and building inclusive, community-engaged knowledge. Dr. Boris Vukovic, Director, Accessibility Institute and Canadian Accessibility Network, AI in Assessment of Functional Limitations and Disability Services for Post-Secondary Education.
Hello, I am Boris Vukovic, a middle-aged man with unruly and unacceptably long graying brown hair. I am a first-generation immigrant to Canada. My role is Director of the Accessibility Institute at Carleton University, which is also the national office for the Canadian Accessibility Network. I have a research faculty appointment with the School of Industrial Design at Carleton University.
What accessibility gaps does your work address?
Well, in the present time, it is about access to supports for students who self-identify as having disability in post-secondary. We do know that about half of this population accesses accessibility or disability services formally. The other half doesn't. And it is also about consistency of information gathering, evaluation of disability-related needs, and the recommendations for supports. In the future time, the possible gaps or the risks, they're about ownership of AI development for disability or accessibility-related services. So we want to make sure that there is input from people with lived experience of disability and disability service providers.
Who gets excluded when these barriers are ignored?
Students with disabilities, as I mentioned, those students who are not formally supported through disability services. And again, students with disabilities in terms of AI development. Historically, we know that AI technologies tend to be developed by specialists and for certain populations rather than with certain populations that they are intended to serve.
What is your work doing to address these accessibility gaps?
Just part of our work is this very exciting project, which is funded by the Tri-Agency of Canada through the program called NFRF, Exploration Stream. It is a high-risk, high-reward research. We are developing an AI prototype for use in accessibility or disability services in post-secondary, and again with this awareness of the importance of participation of people that technology is intended to serve. This project is done in collaboration with accessibility professionals, disability service providers, and students with disabilities. It is a very interdisciplinary project, which is why it's so dynamic and so exciting. We have AI obviously AI specialists, but we have researchers representing many different fields: psychology, education, engineering, disability studies, human rights, and so on.
What next steps would you like to see?
Well, I would like to see engagement on this issue of AI in post-secondary. It's inevitable. So I think it's important that we are proactively participating in this. When I say we, I mean professionals in post-secondary education, specifically professionals in accessibility and disability related student services, and most importantly, students and persons with disabilities themselves to be actively informing and contributing to the development of AI in the future. So I think we need to embrace this rather than be on the receiving end of products that are externally developed for post-secondary education.
Tara Connolly, Assistant Director, Research and Development, Accessible Housing Through an Autism Lens, and Neurodivergent Lens, Recommended Practices for Neuroinclusivity.
Hi, I'm Tara Conley. I'm the Assistant Director of Research and Development with the Accessibility Institute. I'm a middle-aged woman. I have glasses on today. I have a streak of blue hair, and I'm really excited to be here to chat with you today.
What accessibility gaps does your work address?
One of the accessibility gaps that we're addressing through many of our projects is particularly related to neurodivergence, is that many of the environments, systems, policies, standards, all sorts of parts of our environment, service provision, are designed in a way that really work better for neurotypical brains. And we're looking at sort of how we can support and create more accessibility and neuroinclusiveness in society.
Who gets excluded when these barriers are ignored?
Well, certainly we know that when barriers are ignored, it kind of hurts everyone. But when we're talking specifically around creating neuroinclusive spaces, we're looking at there's quite a few self-identities and identities and diagnoses that fall under neurodivergence. But I'll give you a couple of examples when we ignore these barriers, what can occur. For instance, when we design healthcare in a way where waiting rooms are something that someone with high sensitivity to sensory and has some aversions to certain sensory inputs, if they can't actually go to a wait room and will actually make the choice not to go into a waiting room because we're not giving them any alternatives. For instance, staying outside and being called in, having other spaces that are quieter, then we see that people are not accessing the services that are actually quite critical for them. So that's one example where we see when barriers are ignored, that it can really have some very negative effects.
What is your work doing to address these accessibility gaps?
Well, the first piece for us is that making sure in the work that we're doing is actually informed by community. And so the issues that are faced by community and that are important to the community are addressed. So I can give you two examples of work that we're doing. One has to do with housing, which is, of course, an issue for many, many people. It's a pan-Canadian issue, absolutely. But when you add also the notion that there needs to be a right fit for neurodivergent folks in the housing that they have, and that sometimes it can be precarious, the housing that they have because of that fit, right? So navigating things with a landlord, making sure that there's an understanding of what is safe space, what is not, when to let someone know that the environment that you're living in is perhaps substandard. Any of those kind of pieces can come to play. We also see that people who were planning to live at home, they have aging parents, and maybe that will be a possibility, maybe it won't. So there's a lot of precariousness in the housing situation for many, many folks who have expressed that as a challenge. And so that's one of the projects that we're currently working on right now. Another project that we are looking at is supporting standards developers. So anyone who's developing a standard of any kind to actually keep in mind the lived experience and the strengths and the challenges that are faced by neurodivergent folks. The one we're working on in particular is focusing quite a bit on autistic adults, sharing some lived experience about what's important to them as they navigate environments and in their lived experience, so that when we start to educate standards developers about this, they can start to infuse it into the process. Because currently we're developing standards. Yes, we can develop some standards about accessibility itself. However, I think all of our standards need to have a little bit of neuroinclusivity applied to them, at least a lens applied to them as they're being created, as well as the actual standards development process itself, right? So making sure on your technical committees, you're inviting people in who bring that experience as well.
What next steps would you like to see?
Well, I think building on the work that we're doing and the work that many other people in community are doing, I'd like to see the sort of a building of awareness and familiarity, competencies, and sort of some of that myth busting that needs to happen, so that we see that in employers, we see it in service providers, healthcare workers, law enforcement, the whole gamut of everybody needing to really learn how to much better engage. So that engagement is of a higher quality, where we're not asking neurodivergent folks to fit into something that doesn't work for them and that is full of barriers that they have to navigate if they want to be a part. So it's really about that inclusiveness, but first needs to come that understanding and that work.
Kathy Malcolm Edwards, lead Coordinated Accessibility Strategy Implementation, exploring student health and well-being in the context of campus spaces.
Hi, I'm Kathy Malcolm Edwards, and I work at the Accessibility Institute at Carleton University. And in my role there, I lead the accessibility strategy for our campus. I'm a middle-aged woman with shoulder-length brown hair, and I'm wearing glasses and a dark green shirt.
What accessibility gaps does your work address?
We spend approximately 90% of our time in the built environment in North America. And previous research has shown that there are significant implications that this has on our emotional, our physiological, and psychological well-being and our health. It's been studied in some environments like healthcare and workplaces, but based on a wrapping scoping review that was conducted, there's little understanding about the relationship between the built environment and student mental health in post-secondary environments.
Who gets excluded when these barriers are ignored?
Students in post-secondary settings, particularly those with mental health challenges, might get ignored if we don't actually look at this complex relationship. The reason why is this gap of a lack of research. It seems significant given the prevalence of mental health and well-being issues that are experienced by students when they're pursuing their post-secondary education. And coupled with the fiduciary responsibility that students have, or that institutions have, for the safety and duty of care for students, this actually seems like a big gap that we might need to be looking at. So what if we could actually improve or change the design of these campus spaces in a way that could support student mental health outcomes?
What is your work doing to address these accessibility gaps?
So the research begins to address a critical gap in understanding the connection between the built environment and student mental health by giving us an idea of how students might use the built environment on campus, how they perceive it, and how they might use it to support their emotional needs. Student emotional states significantly guide their choices in selecting campus spaces, with an inclination towards areas that might help facilitate coping strategies such as social connection, need for privacy, or even stress management. They're selecting spaces that offer a sense of community, a sense of privacy and tranquility to be able to restore and distress. And it's interesting because there is a bit of a contradiction when you have spaces that are being sought for a sense of community and connection, but also a sense of privacy and isolation. This is where informal spaces on campus really come into play and are most consistently sought after by students on campus, regardless of the emotional state they are experiencing. These environments are favored because they're adaptable and allow students to choose whether or not to connect with peers, maybe find peace, maybe even engage in studying. but it highlights the importance of informal, versatile spaces in addressing both emotional and academic needs of our students in post-secondary environments.
What next steps would you like to see?
I think awareness and understanding of these dynamics could really inform decisions that are being made in campus developments, renovations, as well as student support strategies. So the research suggests that the design and availability of informal, flexible spaces can have a potential impact on students' emotional health, suggesting a need for campuses to prioritize flexible, inclusive environments that address the diverse emotional and psychological needs of the student population. This also can have us re-examine how we're doing our service design and delivery for mental health supports, maybe meeting the students where they are rather than expecting the students to come to where the service might be. And this might allow for more holistic and inclusive interventions to happen.
Dr. Brady Laska, Research Engineer, Accessibility Institute and Department of Systems and Computer Engineering, informing standards for acoustics and the built environment.
Hi, I'm Brady Laska. I'm a research engineer with the Accessibility Institute in the Department of Systems and Computer Engineering at Carleton University. I describe myself as a middle-aged male with light brown hair parted to the side and a short graying beard.
What accessibility gaps does your work address?
Our work looks at acoustic accessibility in the built environment, but I think sound and noise are a gap that's often overlooked in accessible design and in design in general. So part of this is because design is often seen as a visual process. And so while drawings and models can give a sense of the look and the tactile feel of a space, sound is invisible and dynamic. And so our experience of sound in a space depends on the interactions between the physical space and the activities of the people within it, as well as the individual who's experiencing that sound. So designing for sound is messy, and it's often seen as important only for specialized spaces. And so that really leaves us with many parts of the built environment where the acoustic design is what's left after all the other decisions have been made.
Who gets excluded when these barriers are ignored?
So I'd like to give an example. Something that I have a lot of personal experience with is small town arenas. So these buildings have understandably been built with cost as a primary factor. The ductwork is exposed. The walls tend to be flat, simple concrete cinder blocks, and the ceilings are flat steel decking. There's a lot of sounds associated with the activities in these spaces, but with the hard, flat surfaces, there's nothing to absorb that sound. There's nowhere for it to go. It reflects and echoes around in the spaces and builds up over time, creating a complex and chaotic sound environment. There's a barrier for a wide range of people. So typically when we think of sound and noise, we think of communication barriers for people who are deaf and hard of hearing. Acoustics can also be a barrier for people who are blind and low vision and who use sound cues for navigation and wayfinding. These cues are distorted or masked by the reflections or the noise that builds up. More often overlooked are individuals with invisible disabilities. This includes differences in sensory processing and attention, brain injuries such as stroke or concussion, or cognitive changes resulting from aging. It's in the brain that we separate the sounds and extract meaning from the sounds that we're hearing. And in noisier, echoey environments, the accumulated sound in those chaotic spaces, this not only interferes with our ability to focus on a single sound, it can harm and focus attention on activities that are unrelated to the sound at all. And for some individuals, just being in that kind of space can be overwhelming and provoke feelings of anxiety and physical discomfort.
What is your work doing to address these accessibility gaps?
Our work looks at the acoustic environment through accessibility and engineering lenses. So since sound is invisible, our work tries to make it more visible to increase the awareness of the role that it plays. We try to improve the understanding of the roles of sound and noise beyond communication and how the presence or absence of sound can impact functioning of persons with and without disabilities. We also ask what a good sound environment looks like for different individuals, and we look at ways of measuring and quantifying the impact of sound and noise using everyday tools to better understand what technologies and techniques can be used to reduce the barriers associated with poor acoustics and to increase functioning and participation in these spaces.
What next steps would you like to see?
Our research is finding that sound and noise are subjective and there's no perfect environment for all people on all activities. So we'd like to know how we can combine the sometimes conflicting needs and wants of different individuals to create more inclusive acoustic spaces. So these are spaces that don't rely on assistive technologies for baseline accessibility, but they can be seamlessly augmented with different technologies that can enhance participation and personalize the experience of sound within the space.
Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to watching the other contributors and connecting with you during the conference Q&A. From all of us at the Accessibility Institute, take care.